Welcome to Glass in Session. I'm your host, Val. Thank you so much for clicking play, for subscribing, and for supporting the show, and being into the somewhat fringe wine topics that I like to throw down here. This season took a strange turn as many areas I've had on my editorial calendar for some time found themselves under siege in one way or another. And while that wasn't the original motivation for this series, I've found so much inspiration in studying these regions. I've found that knowing more about the history and culture of what's in a glass of wine from Lebanon, Albania, Armenia, it really does add another layer of character. And this, dear listener, is what drew me to the study of wine in the first place. And this, dear listener, is what led me on this particular crazy journey fueled by current batshit world events to this week's episode. Iran. I know. Early on in our wine studies, we tend to learn more about how to tell the difference between a Cab and a Pinot Noir in a glass, the difference between Bordeaux and Burgundy, blah, blah, blah. France is the wine mothership calling us home. But when I was in my International Somm Guild classes 15 years ago, I was fascinated to learn about the cradle of wine civilization and what the Epic of Gilgamesh had to do with any of it. And if you're a rabid listener to this show, you and I have that thirst for the less superficial aspects of the fermented grape, and you too want to go beyond the insipid tasting notes. You're here because you want to experience wine, not just consume it. And that's what leads us to this week's session on Iran. When I said something to the effect of, F it, I'm going there, I was nothing short of obsessed with bringing you this session. So let's do this thing. Iran. Usually I say let's start with finding it on a map, but I'm pretty sure, thanks to recent jackassery and incompetence of certain countries' regimes, we're all quite aware of it. But if you are like me and would rather listen to a History Extra podcast, shout out, on medieval Welsh law, or maybe binge a whole entire empire series, shout out, on the Ottomans instead of listening to the news, you might need a refresher. We find Iran in Western Asia, and it borders a crap ton of countries. The best way to describe it is to start in the north on the south shores of the Caspian Sea. Moving clockwise and east, we hit Turkmenistan, rounding the northeastern corner to Afghanistan. Pakistan is just below that, tracing Iran's eastern border south, right, smack into the Gulf of Oman, leading to the Arabian Sea to the south. Now, we just sail west toward the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, opened or closed right now, who the hell knows, and then we curve into the Persian Gulf, riding Iran's coastline north and west where we land in Iraq. Then we head north along Iran's western border to Turkey. Once we round the very northwestern tip of Iran's border with Turkey, we bang a hard right into Iran's border with a small part of Azerbaijan, ride that little saddle across a small part of Armenia and back into Azerbaijan before we end up back at the Caspian Sea. I hope that painted a little bit of an image for you in your head. If not, I've linked up worldatlas.com and there's a really cool map there. But it does sound like a fun tour, and what a neighborhood, am I right? Other goodies I found on worldatlas.com are that Iran is, as country size goes, the 17th largest in the world and the second largest Middle Eastern country. It's a very mountainous country with a large chunk of the terrain being above 1,500 feet or 460 meters. So let's cruise on to history. The earliest origins of wine culture in Iran take us all the way back to about 5400 BCE. Iran's claim to the cradle of wine civilization, or wine's birthplace, the Vitis vinifera OG, is well documented. And we start with some wine jars archaeologists unearthed in a Neolithic settlement kitchen in Haji Firuz Tepe, tucked away in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. In these jars was evidence of grape wine residue, I believe tartaric acid, and the whole shebang was dated to sometime around 5400 BCE. But these are not the only ones. They found wine jars in other Zagros Mountain Bronze Age sites, and even from a palace from the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which was from 550 BCE, the time of Cyrus II or Cyrus the Great, through 330 BCE, Darius III, who would inevitably be brought down by Alexander the Great. This means they beat the Greeks by a couple of thousand years and even schooled the Egyptians when it came to wine. Speaking of this classical era of Persian history, during which time the Achaemenid Empire was the largest empire in the world, winemaking and viticulture were prolific. So to give you an idea of the size of this empire, if you were to pull up a map of the Middle East, everything I'm going to name was part of the Persian Empire. So we're going to take Iran, Iraq, or Mesopotamia. This was the core. And then from there we have Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Turkey, Bahrain, the northern fringe of Saudi Arabia, Oman's coastal area, and every once in a while part of Yemen. This was all part of the Achaemenid Empire. Oh, and so were the Caucasus, where we now have Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan to the north. The empire expanded west, hoovering up Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and the southern fringes of Kyrgyzstan. South Asia was part of the empire, specifically northwestern India and Pakistan's Indus Valley region. Oh, but wait, there's more. On the African continent, that's right, we suck in Egypt and Libya's eastern coastal strip, and even parts of Europe, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Thrace, and parts of mainland Greece occasionally. Oh, but wait, I'm not done. At times, we can count Ukraine or southern Russia during a brief Scythian era. At its height, 2 to 3 million square miles of Persian Empire wine-loving goodness, people. Is it any wonder the vine spread as it did? The capital of this empire was known as Persepolis, where in 1933, during an excavation by the Oriental Institute, archaeologists unearthed some clay tablets called the Persepolis Fortification Tablets. Now, they are not called fortification tablets because they had anything to do with making fortified wine, because that was the first thought running through my head. These were found among palace ruins in Persepolis in a fortification wall. Okay, makes sense. And what they tell us about wine specifically during this time was that from 509 to 494 BCE, wine was used as payment along with food. Now, the bigger picture is that these were like administrative logbooks. They tracked food distribution and who received these payments, such as worshippers of different religions and travelers, etc. Oh yes, the Persian kings, such as the aforementioned Cyrus the Great all the way through Darius, they totally dug them some fermented juice of the grape. Greek historian Herodotus writes about this in his book Histories, Book 1, chapters 131 through 140, all about Persian culture at the time. And it turns out, not only did ancient Persians, let's just say, appreciate the hell out of wine and drink it in large quantities and undiluted, unlike the Beta Greeks who watered down their hooch. What Herodotus also tells us is that these fine vintage wines, mostly from Persia, but also from Syria, they were consumed in mass quantities, and they were not serving the purpose of just getting tanked, although he would judge them if they were getting tanked. But to the ancient Persians, wine indeed served as a symbol of generosity, affluence, and wines were important to making major decisions to ensure balanced judgment. Working through some grave matter of diplomacy? Do it whilst knackered, then do it sober. If the sober deliberating body agrees with the drunk deliberating body, then the proposed action is carried. If not, it is tabled. And vice versa. Trying to solve world peace whilst sober? That's nice. Now try it after a few glasses of Rache from its home, Sardasht in the Zagros Mountains. Maybe some vino will help with that whole Strait of Hormuz situation, since America can't be bothered to send qualified negotiators to the table. Send in the royal cupbearer. It is important to point out that Zoroastrianism was an underlying theme in many ancient Persian cultural elements, some of which live on today. So as the Achaemenid Empire was coming to a close, wine was still an essential part of life, even worked into rituals all the way up to the 7th century current era. Zoroaster actually wrote that winemaking and drinking were all part of some cosmic system. For example, the most ideal time to harvest grapes was, quote, when the moon is in Cancer or Leo, or in Libra, or Scorpio, or in Capricorn, or Aquarius, end quote. Either way, there was a divine element tied to wine, so it makes sense that it was part of religious observations, but just don't overdo it, okay? Moving on to the period of Islamic conquest from the 7th century CE onward. This period, despite dropping the Islamic hammer on booze production, did not really decimate viticulture in Persia, unlike what it did to other Muslim countries around the Med. Grapes were still an important part of the economy in terms of food, raisins, and even juice for household use. Wine was still being made, particularly when it came to more affluent households, and wine was still being traded by the resident Christians and Jews in places like Isfahan, Shiraz, and other key growing areas. Shirazi local 14th century poet Hafez sings the praises of wine from Shiraz, the town, not the grape, and, by the way, no relation, we'll get to that, thusly, quote, "Come, O wine pourer, circulate a cup and pass it, since love seemed easy at first, but soon troubles arose," end quote. Wine, not only great for diplomacy, but also for the lovesick. French jeweler Jean Chardin wrote in 1686 after his tour of Persia that Shirazi wine was, quote, "excellent and famous," end quote. And he'd even delivered some tasting notes, if you will, on the color, palate, and even his opinions on what appears to be a balanced wine, and that, quote, "it is not one of those strong wines that pleases the palate straight away," end quote. Wine made in Shiraz was traded with the Europeans, and the trade was still happening with the East Indies in the 16 and 1700s. All the way up until the 1979 Islamic Revolution, one could get alcohol in Iran. It wasn't just the wine industry, where there were hundreds of wineries, something like 300 wineries up until that time. There were bars, there were nightclubs, there were even liquor stores. But alas, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, aka Why People Can't Have Nice Things, is where the bottle-smashing tantrums began, as well as the destruction of wineries nationwide. If you were caught committing the offense of winemaking, you would suffer the consequences of a public flogging. So while the general population is not allowed to make, sell, or consume publicly the fermented and or distilled juice of the fruit, grain, potato, or whatever, there are some exceptions for people who are not Muslim, including Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and they can imbibe to a limited degree. Tourists? Nope, no public drinking. But there are special exceptions for people with diplomatic ties and, of course, rich people, because laws don't apply to them. So on with that world peace thing. Okay, thanks, bye. Now, if you break the law, you can be arrested, fined, or worse. On the Molana website, we're told that there were a few discreetly operating wineries in the 1990s. Apparently, the government made exceptions, such as for Christians or Jews to produce and use wines for religious ceremonies, as was the case throughout history. I often say the church is one of the reasons viticulture and winemaking actually survived for centuries, including in Europe. Molana Wines is the name of the wine that I talked about in the last season on Armenian wines. This is made by an Armenian winemaker and his daughter, Vahe Kushgorian, and his daughter Amy, where he went across the border, grabbed some grapes from Iran, took them back, had them shipped back to Armenia, and made the wine. I'll talk more about that later, but the word Molana translates to our master, and it's kind of a reference to Rumi. In fact, sometimes people still refer to Rumi, the poet from the 13th century, as Molana. I will certainly drink to that, and also to the present day, those of the Iranian diaspora making wine today. And let's talk about a couple of those. Dariush Khaledi fled Iran during the 1978 revolution and established the Dariush Winery in Napa Valley in 1998. And I love how on their website they state their vision as being, quote, rooted in the taharov, end quote, which is the Persian art of gracious hospitality. Then there's the absolute banging wine I'm drinking right now by Mo Momtazi. He's another Iranian immigrant who founded the Mizrah Winery in McMinnville, Oregon in 1997. The word Mizrah translates to house of wine in ancient Persian. Mo and his wife moved back here because he was actually here studying at one point and they had moved back to Iran. But his wife Flora refused to wear the chador. So as Mo tells Forbes in the 2017 article I linked up for you, quote, "The revolution in Iran and the hostage crisis happened a bit later after our return. It was then that things got really ugly. My wife refused to cover herself and young kids with machine guns would stop her and harass her. We escaped through the mountains of Pakistan, ended up in Spain, and then on to Italy. We entered the USA through Mexico, and I filed for political asylum," end quote. I find it interesting that both Dariush and Mo were both civil engineers. They both moved here from Iran around the same time and both opened vineyards in the late 1990s. And a little bit more on this Pinot Gris I have my lips on right now. The first thing I noticed was a pronounced summer and tropical fruit like pineapple and apricot, but also pretty white flowers. I took the glass into my husband who was sitting in the living room. I'm like, "Honey," and I just held the glass out to him. And he took a whiff and he looked at me. He goes, "Oh, that's a well-made wine." After he sipped, of course. It is a light to medium-bodied wine. It's got balanced acidity. And that's when we talk about well-made wines, that's one of the things we're talking about. The pronouncement of the aromas, the flavors, the attack on the palate, the balance between the acidity, the fruit sweetness, and the length. It was a medium plus finish with a touch of that phenolic bitterness I love in a well-made Pinot Gris. and it was under $20. This is not an ad. This is just something I was happy to find since I learned about this winery in one of the audiobooks I narrated this year by Pacific Northwest Wine and Spirits writer Becky Garrison. Shout out, Becky. That was such a fun book to do. Then in the Armenian wine episode, I mentioned Vahe Kushgurian smuggling the Rache grapes. I shouldn't say smuggling, but getting those Rache grapes across the border into Armenia to make wine, this Molana that I mentioned earlier. I talked about a Psalm TV episode called Cup of Salvation about Armenian wine. And about 2/3 into the film, we learn about Vahe's plan, the acquisition of the grapes, where the Rache and the wine, which Momamtazi of Mizara actually gets to taste. I'm going to leave it there because I don't want to spoil the ending for you if you do want to geek out on this film, and I left the link up in the show notes of this episode as well. But as far as wine stories and interesting pieces of wine media I've encountered, this is one of my favorites in forever. I also saw this quote by Rumi on the Molana website that I absolutely love. Quote, "Bring the pure wine of love and freedom. But sir, a tornado is coming. More wine. We'll teach this storm a thing or two about whirling." End quote. The thing I like about this quote, first of all, I love Rumi. I have some of the poetry books that were translated from ancient Persian, but also the irony that the reference is to whirling dervishes. And there's a whole article about Rumi, Sufism, and the whirling dervish connection if you want to go deeper. Now, my connection to whirling dervishes is that when I was in vacation in Charleston, back around, I think it was 2008, I wandered into this cafe that was recommended to me by the B&B owner. And he said, "Oh, yeah, the owner is really awesome. He's a whirling dervish." And I remember eating Middle Eastern food and sampling some wines, probably a little too many wines because I went shopping. I think it's called Queen Street in Charlotte. I can't remember, but there was a jewelry place and then there was a Lucky store. And I remember buying a T-shirt. It was like a $50 T-shirt. I've never paid $50 for a T-shirt. And I still have it. It's still one of my favorite T-shirts. And then there was a necklace sitting on a jewelry counter when I walked in made of tourmaline. And I was really into like rocks and stuff. And I was like, oh my God, that necklace is for me. And I still, to this day, it's my favorite necklace. I still wear it. The moral of the story, don't drink and shop, but I kind of blame the whirling dervish for the whole thing. Anyway, okay, I've done enough gabbing on that. It's time to gab the grapes. We know that Vitis vinifera is at home historically in Iran. Encyclopedia Iranica tells us that of all the fruit plants cultivated in Iran, this species of grapevine is most likely the oldest and the most well-known. Sure, other things like grains may have beat the grapes to the punch, but the Angor grape has a long storied history in Iran. Currently, as in Afghanistan, the grapes harvested in Iran are all sold as table grapes, although there are huge differences in the country's industries, market, trade access, and production. And it's interesting because the countries do have kind of a similar, they share a border, they have a similar climate, if you will, similar conditions. But Afghanistan relies heavily on grapes as their number one fruit crop. Iran's production is much larger, for example. While Afghanistan's grape harvest can range anywhere from 600,000 tons to over 1 million annually, Iran yields over 3 million tons of grapes a year and is the third largest raisin exporter globally behind Turkey and the United States. There are also historic wine-producing regions in Iran. I've already mentioned Shiraz in the Fars province, south of Esfahan, almost to the Persian Gulf. Viticulture was practiced here as far back as 2500 BCE, and this region is known for the full-bodied reds. But let me state again that there is no DNA evidence of the Persian grapes from Shiraz being related to the Syrah grapes of the Rhone Valley, or Shiraz if you're in Australia and other places in the New World. Kazvin, which is just northwest of Tehran and just south of the Caspian Sea, is one of the oldest wine regions in the country, also known for spice-laden, full-bodied reds. Moving west to the Zagros Mountains, we find the aforementioned Sardasht. It's in northwestern Iran. It's Persian for sard, which means cold, and dasht, which means plain. And it's home to the indigenous Rache grape. Rache translates to fine drizzle of rain. And it's an ancient Persian variety that produces dark, small-berried clusters known for their concentrated flavors of dark berry and ripe, dark red fruits, black cherries, and natural acidity. And this is the grape that you find in the Molana wine. These grapes from this region that Kushgurian made in Armenia. Now, moving east to Gilan and the Caspian region, these are lush valleys near the Caspian Sea with fertile soils, and Momamtazi actually says that Oregon reminds him of this area in Iran near the Caspian Sea. Another historic grape-growing area in Iran is in the Jawzan Valley in the Hamadan province in northwestern Iran. And there are about 3,000 or so hectares of grapes being used for everything from vinegar to raisins to what they call syrup to grapeseed oil and jam. There are about 40 different products in all, not wine. They grow 130 different grape varieties and were formally recognized in 2018, about the same time as the Soave vineyards in Italy, as a globally important agricultural heritage system, a GIAHS, because of their practices, their biodiversity, and preservation of ecosystems. Bottom line, grapes are grown. Grapes are important. Many of these grapes are vitis vinifera. Let's make wine. And peace. Wouldn't it be cool to see Iran make wine again? I think so. But until then, we have some ballsy winemakers around the world making beautiful statements in a freaking glass. I often say wine can tell stories if we care to listen. Wine can be a source of community, if not communication. And that, dear listener, is what I hope you got out of this week's session. I raise my glass to those who choose peace over war, who choose freedom over petty-ass tyranny, to those who choose hospitality and humanity over hubris, and to you who choose this silly winecast over all the other choices you have when you are, as John Heilemann says, basking in the splendor of the podcast universe. Thank you so much for sharing these wackadoodle times with me in your ear, for sharing, for subscribing, which keeps that precious spot for me open in your podcast feed. You can always reach out to me via email, val@glassandsession.com or glassandsession@proton.me. On the socials, pick your poison, Blue Sky, Glass and Session. Vina with Val on Threads and Instagram, and you'll see Glass and Session trademarked in my bio. I'm on Spoutable, Glass and Session. I'm on Substack, glassandsession.substack.com. I'm Vina with Val on Pinterest and on Facebook /Glass and Session when they're not kicking me off. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Valerie Caruso, DWS, CWE, FWS, letters, wine stuff, and audiobook narrator. Which reminds me, you can find this podcast and the latest audiobooks I've narrated on Audible. There is Glass and Session swag in my TeePublic store, linked all the way at the bottom of these show notes and on my website. Thank you to those of you who are supporting this show. Glass and Session is a production and registered trademark of Vina with Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joystock. Website is glassandsession.com/podcast.